During the 1993 Game Developers Conference, Chris Crawford, game designer and founder of the event, sprinted out of a crowded room with a sword in his hand, chasing after a dragon. In his speech, which preceded this bizarre moment, he discussed his personal history as a game designer using a dragon as a metaphor for his dream, realizing games as an art form. Crawford's vision for the medium was one where it would be driven by storytelling and capable of representing the full breadth of human emotion and experience. He felt alone in this dream, occupying an industry where his colleagues' only concern seemed to be finding new ways to kill things, and so he drew his sword, chased his dragon alone, and never returned to commercial game development. In a lot of ways, history has vindicated Crawford. For the past few decades, there's been a growing subset of people primarily interested in games as a form of storytelling. Most analysis of games you'll find out there evaluates the work from a literary perspective, and with the rise of indie games, there's been an ever-increasing amount of projects that strip out challenge and mechanics to create experiences focusing entirely on narrative. As someone who's mostly interested in arcade games from several decades ago, the lack of deep mechanical analysis tends to bug me quite a bit, but I do see a lot of potential in games as a storytelling tool, and am personally interested in pursuing that. However, I still have a couple problems with the way narrative design is typically handled. Firstly, in games that are trying to get across some kind of negative emotional experience, the go-to way to accomplish that is to simply take an already existing gameplay system and rob it of all its depth and nuance. The shallowness of No More Heroes' combat represents how desensitized to violence Travis Touchdown has become. The excessively punishing enemy AI in Hotline Miami 2 drives home the panic and fragility of a gunfight, etc., etc. Games like this are sacrificing their competitive aspects in order to flesh out role-playing aspects that try to put you in the character's headspace. But personally, very rarely do I find any of it convincing. Role-playing is interesting when you get to set the parameters of your role and test boundaries, but this style of role-playing actively prevents you from doing anything except what the game wants you to do, and for me it completely shatters the illusion until I see both the narrative and gameplay not as an emotional experience but as a malfunctioning machine. My other beef with narrative design is that I'm unconvinced games can accurately represent certain ideas in the first place. I actually have experience making this kind of thing. The first game I ever released was a project called No One Can Ever Know, which was a version of Resident Evil with most of the decision-making stripped out. I chose to build it that way to better represent gender dysphoria, the constant barrage of self-loathing thoughts and the struggle to find ways to distract yourself from them. While I feel it could be relatable to other trans people and give cis people some level of insight into what it's like to be a closeted trans person, in a way it also feels disrespectful to my own lived experience to suggest that I could flatten my emotions into computer code. On some level, I know it's a little silly and that every medium runs up against limitations like this in one way or another, but it genuinely keeps me up at night, worrying if the game trivializes what a real threat dysphoria is. I'm not sure a meter on a computer screen will ever be sophisticated enough to get across these kinds of serious ideas in a way that feels authentic. Someone who agreed with me was actually Chris Crawford. He calls this style of design I've been describing thaumatropic games, referring to games where you alternate between a bit of story and a bit of gameplay in the hopes that the two will complement each other and create the illusion of a unified piece similar to a thaumatrope. He didn't view this as true interactive storytelling, and so after he left the game industry in the 90s, he spent the next few decades trying to develop technology that would allow players to interact with fictional characters in deeper, more dramatically rich ways. He halted work in 2018 after he became convinced there wasn't enough cultural momentum behind his ideas to realize the project within his lifetime. It's sad, but Crawford's quest to slay his dragon wasn't in vain. His penultimate game, Balance of the Planet, is proof of that. It may not meet his standards of interactive storytelling, but it still does a better job addressing my complaints with narrative design than basically any other game I've played. It's a simulation game where you're put in charge of the climate crisis, as you enact policies with the goal of minimizing harm to the planet. Despite the really intimidating visual design, gameplay is remarkably simple. Each turn, you choose which industries you want to either tax or subsidize, and then you end your turn. That's all you have to do. Of course, it's a little more complicated than that. The game gives feedback about which areas of life improved and which areas deteriorated at the end of every turn, and you need to use this information to judge how you should govern. If you notice a large amount of lung cancer deaths in a given year, you can click on the lung cancer text and be brought into a massive web of cause and effect screens which will trace each death to its source down to the atomic level. These chains of cause and effect are the core of the game. You can read about how all the lung cancer is being caused by burning coal and decide to tax the shit out of the coal industry to curb that. But plenty of regions still rely on it for fuel, so discouraging production too much will reduce quality of life and cause more problems for yourself. The thing about climate change is that the world we inherited was already busted, so you can't fix one area without screwing up another. Balance of the Planet's game systems convey this flawlessly. And I mean, what a concept for a game, yeah? That desperate struggle to mitigate risk is like the heart of game design, and there's no greater risk than the fate of our real-life, actual planet. Because the game adheres to a strict turn-based system and lacks randomized elements, it's essentially a puzzle game, which is normally a turnoff for me, but there's a couple things keeping my interest. The biggest one being that the success and failure states are incredibly fuzzy. Ending the game with negative points is pretty clearly considered a loss, but there's no obvious cap on the amount of points you can gain, so even when you win, there's always this feeling that you could have improved your score just a little more, if only you would put effort into solving different problems. Because of this, the game has a stronger sense of replayability than your average puzzler. The other way it transcends typical puzzle design is how it deals with the morality of your actions. Climate change is obviously a very loaded topic. Everyone has a different value system for determining the worth of certain industries and ideas. Crawford was aware of this and knew that an accurate simulation would have to account for each player's personal ideology. The way he went about solving this conflict was to allow you to modify every equation that governs the game. So to use lung cancer as an example again, the way its points are calculated is with this formula: the value of human life multiplied by the number of lung cancer deaths. And that's fucked up. How are you supposed to quantify a human life? It runs up against the problem I discussed earlier, where games have to flatten the truth of suffering down to an easy set of numbers, but Balance of the Planet manages to turn this weakness into a strength, because under our current capitalist system, we have two choices when it comes to climate change: put a price tag on life or go extinct. Unfortunately for us, the people in control of our world don't seem to think the average person is worth all that much. In this way, the game's numerical obsession feels like an accurate reflection of our reality. But wait, this game actually goes deeper than that. There are all different kinds of people in this world and different biases about their worth to match. One of climate change's effects is an increase in starvation, but starvation largely affects people in the global south, and surely those people's lives aren't worth as much as ours, right? By default, the game values people living in the third world significantly less than everyone else. It's such an infinitesimally small value, it has to be written out in scientific notation. And even with such a small number, starvation has far and away the biggest negative impact on your overall score, since the amount of people who starve every day is so incalculably large. It's the bleakest goddamn thing that's ever been put into a video game. But wait, it still goes deeper than that. You can determine how much a person who dies of lung cancer is worth, but what if you don't even agree with how many lung cancer deaths will occur due to climate change? Well, like I said, you're in control of every single equation in this game, giving climate deniers a seat at the table. If you don't believe a problem is as serious as all those dorky scientists are saying it is, you can force the world to conform to your reality and have a significantly easier time winning the game. There are even a bunch of presets representing these different morality systems known as bias files. Selecting one at the start of the game allows you to play from either the perspective of an environmentalist, a leader in the global south, or an industrialist. If you play as an industrialist, you get to win the game while doing literally nothing each turn. This frankly insane degree of control you're afforded solves the other narrative design problem I mentioned earlier. While most games aiming to bum you out do so by removing the depth from an already existing game or genre, Balance of the Planet systems is built entirely from scratch in order to maximize personal choice and create a much more thorough role-playing experience. It allows you to occupy multiple different characters' headspaces, all of which instill an overwhelming sense of dread and frustration without ever robbing you of your own personal choices and values. It is absolutely masterful narrative design, maybe the best ever. For as much of an eccentric Chris Crawford is, I find his passion and dedication deeply inspiring. I also have a dragon I'd like to slay, a little bit different from his. I want to spend my life seeing if I can build deep, toy-like games that aren't a hindrance to my narrative ambitions, but also aren't limited by them either. That's my dragon, and I'm currently working on a game that attempts to kill it. I already know I don't have the experience needed to fully satisfy that goal, but if I can ever come as close as Crawford did, I think I'll be able to die happy.